Peace fell upon the land as the desert nation of Aranam showed the world that clans of predator and prey could live side by side, united under one banner. New towns and city-states were born from the examples set by Xion and the Aranam. In the northeast, Roy and his lions brought together the hardy inhabitants of the Red Clay Mountains. In the southern forest, villages sprang up as predator and prey band together in the pursuit of coin and pleasure. In the southeast, the water dwellers of the giant lake founded the eastern stronghold of Aquatica, an offshoot of the larger kingdom said to exist beneath the waves of the Western Ocean. The southwestern swamp was made larger by the river that Xion made to the north and the east, and trade and travel turned the swamp into a booming territory. The Aranam pirates were made more successful from Edic's agreement with Xion, and many of them who had made their fortune from trade came to live in the desert. Because the pirates' treasure was now in the desert, Edic didn't have to execute people to keep its location secret, and was held in a higher regard than Predin as a result. Though many clans still hunted each other for food, a fragile unity existed among them like no beast of the field had ever known. Xion and Azioi had 2 more sons. Their eldest son Theus was born 3 years after they returned from the west. He was fast and strong, wild and free like his mother, with silver hair and his father's shimmering green eyes, and the mark of the dark gift. Derek, the baby of the 2, was born 4 years after Theus, with snow-white hair and his mother's blue eyes. There was no sign that the infant had any of the dark gifts. Xion's sons were all well trained in the magics, fighting styles, hunting, gathering skills, and traditions of all the desert clans. They often played among the trees of the forest under Ozioi's watchful eye, and Xion taught his boys to tame the beast that dwelt within them as he shouldered the responsibility of a father and leader of a growing nation. And for a time all was good. Xion sat at the head of a long table lined with the leaders of the desert clans. They were squabbling over something trivial, and Xion was half listening as he gazed out the window. The sun was shining, and there was a gentle breeze. He would much rather be out there than he dealing with the politics of the day. "You are not the king yet." Oliver sat to Xion's left and had spoken out of turn again. Teddy was swift to remind him he was there to observe only. "What do you think, Lord Xion?" Xion asked. He knew Xion had no idea what was going on, so he looked directly into his eyes to make himself easier to read. This was something Xion and the rest of the original council had become accustomed to. They often shared their thoughts during meetings with Xion this way. "I have seen enough of the Deer clan around to say they have returned to the desert, and they deserve a seat on this council. The protests of the wolves has been noted." Xion replied. "That is the last issue of the day. We will reconvene next month." The council had almost doubled in size since its inception, as clans had begun to return to the desert. It was teeming with life now thanks to regular rain, and the safety the title Aranam offered. "Father, why did you do that?" Oliver asked as he and Xion walked the corridors of the hillside fortress. "Because the deer will bring their own benefits to the desert. But you have distanced the wolves and made hunting harder for everyone." Oliver replied. "Why do you put up with them, father? Half of them either hate or fear you, and then you go and make decisions like that and undermine the people that support you the most. Their fear is not unfounded, Oliver. Besides, their belief in the Aranam trumps their feelings, or they would not be here. And friends or not, we can never play favorites." "And what about you, father? What do you mean?" Xion asked, but he knew what Oliver meant. "Father, they can't read you, but I can," Oliver replied, pointing at the mark on his forehead. "You don't want to do this. Not just the meetings, the mediation, the planning, all of it. And if you don't want to be king, then why won't you stand aside and let me take the throne, or Buse, or Xion, or Matera?" "You're not ready," Xion replied, turning to Oliver, slightly frustrated. "How? Why? What have I not done? Have I not wrestled with badgers, hunted with wolves, learned the wisdom of rabbits and buzzards, survived scorpion venom, and learned to heal with a moth's prayer? What more must I do to show you that I am ready? Xion gave a deep sigh. It's not strength or wisdom. It's compassion that you lack. You must learn to handle their hate and fear, Oliver, without letting it sway you. I have had you learn from them so that you can see this world through their eyes, so that you can understand how they see me, and how they'll see you. If you try to rule them by force or fear, they'll end you, Oliver. And worse, if you fear them, you'll become a monster, and the Union of the Desert will crumble. I'm already a monster, Oliver replied as he looked away. And that's why it has to be us, Xion replied. We are the only ones who can wield this sword because we are the only ones strong enough to protect it. Oliver started to reply but was interrupted by a shout from down the corridor. Xion! Azayora called after him as he and Oliver walked past the main ground entrance. She walked up stroking Derek, who was curled up as a fox pup in her arms, nestled against her breast, and Theus in his human form, following close behind, sprinted past her and ran to tackle Oliver. Big brother. Theus changed to a fox midair, and Oliver changed quickly to meet him. The two began to scrap their way down the corridors. Xion and Ozai looked on until the boys rounded the corner. Then Xion turned his attention to the young pup in Ozio's arms with a warm smile. How was the forest? He asked as he shifted his eyes to Ozai. A lot has changed since they started trading goods with merchants from the coast. Then again, a lot hasn't. Your father? Xion replied knowingly. Yes, among other things. The boys enjoy tumbling around the underbrush, so I brought them with me. This poor little guy was too tired to walk home. Derek raised his head sleepily, and Xion stroked him beneath his chin. Father is still horribly disappointed in me, Azayoi said sarcastically as she rolled her eyes. I suppose he'll get over it or die mad, Xion replied with a grin. The traders in the forest are doing well, and the lessers are slowly gaining the right to bargain. Xion's mood changed when Azayoi said lesser. He really hated the word, and Azayoi quickly realized her mistake. Sorry, bad habits, she said, looking away. It's all right, Xion replied. Derek woke, and Azayoi sat him down gently. He gave a big stretch, then changed to his human form and rubbed his eyes. Mummy, Daddy, he said sleepily. Good morning, sleepyhead, Azayoi said with a warm smile. Where is Theus and Oliver? Derek yawned. They went back to their den, Xion replied as he squatted down and ran his fingers through Derek's white hair. Derek wrapped him in a hug and exploded in giggles as Xion picked him up, threw him in the air, and spun him around before setting him back down. Go play, Xion said as he pointed him toward the boy's room and gave him a gentle pat. Azayoi sat at the top of the cliffside as she did every moonless night. In the forest, the moonless night was a night of fear for prey that hid, unable to see predators, and other than the owls and wolves, no one prowled the forest. Azayoi loved nights like this. The forest was so quiet and beautiful in the dark. She loved the smell of the trees, the feel of the wind, and the general sleepiness of it all. Not like the desert that seemed to come alive at night as the lights from the villages began to dot and dance in the sand. She wondered now as she took a drink of her gin and looked out over the desert, was she to hide on her boys? Had she been to hard on Oliver as she pushed him to be the next king? She was sure her father would approve of her efforts. But that thought did not make her feel any better. Xion stroked Tulam's shoulder as he got up from their bedding. He could not believe how far the world had come. He looked to the south and thought of Xion, the fox who changed the world, and smiled. Matera tucked each of her children in for the night, grateful for each of their faces that reminded her in some way of her lost love. She thanked Sententia for granting Xion the strength to stop her father all those years ago and bring the peace her children would know all their lives. Jack and Connie shared a meal by candlelight with their neighbors, a pair of badgers that had moved into what was once the grand burrow of rabbits. It was on this moonless night that Arenia crept into the room of the fox pups. Arenia crept gently up the bed, across Oliver's maroon locks, and onto his sandy skin. She began gently stroking his neck and drawing out a spell. You have done well, noble bird," Arenia whispered to herself. Her legs began to tremble as she continued her cipher, moth magics, and that scorpion wretch as well. She changed her cipher gently while quietly humming a haunting melody, taking extra care to not wake Oliver. As she finished, Arenia sank her fangs into her cipher and leaped from Oliver's neck as he began to stir. Oliver woke as Arenia screamed off into the shadows to watch her plan unfold. At first he was burning up, then it was as if cold lightning was pulsing through him. His thoughts began to race, and he began to mumble and growl as he tried to resist Arenia's spell. Then his thoughts became narrowed, and he fell silent. Xion, kill him. Theus woke as Oliver got up and left the room. Brother, Theus called as he watched Oliver leave the room. As Oliver left, Theus turned to Derek, sleeping heavily. He covered his little brother up and snuggled up to him. He started to drift back to sleep. Then there was a thud and a yelp from the corridor, and Theus bolted upright. What was that? Derek said sleepily, not opening his eyes. I will go see. Go back to sleep, Theus said as he crawled out from under the blanket. His words were wasted as Derek had already tucked his face into the blanket and fallen back to sleep. Xion was on her way to check in on her boys, as she did every night before she laid down with Xion. As she rounded the corner, she met Oliver. He was shaking as if he were cold despite the night's warmth. Oliver. He looked up at her, and as their eyes met, something in his chilled her. Was this the beast she had seen on the mountain all those years ago? Oliver. What is wrong? Talk to me, she pleaded as she slowly stepped back and took her human form. Oliver stood like a cold stone with a faraway stare. Xion wasn't looking at him anymore. Her attention had turned to the room he had come from. She made up her mind and hoped Xion could forgive her as she reached out to Oliver slowly with one hand while her other hand reached for the dagger at her waist. If Oliver was losing control, he had to be stopped now. Oliver jolted forward, and Xion drew her blade. He grabbed Ozio's extended hand and dug his claws in deep, pulling her forward and throwing her off balance. She tried to stab him with her free hand, but Oliver turned his body to the side and changed to a fox, causing her to only graze his thigh as he spun and sunk his teeth deep into her neck, and the two of them hit the ground hard. Xion let out a yelp as she struggled to push herself up with Oliver on her back. She stabbed at him wildly, trying to find her mark, but Oliver had retaken his human form and grabbed the wrist of Ozio's knife hand, digging his claws in and causing her to drop the blade. Then with a jerk of his head there was a snap, and Xion went limp. Blood poured from Oliver's mouth as he let her head fall to the floor. She was not his target after all, and the voice in his head was screaming now, Xion. Theus found Xion laying face down in a pool of her blood. He screamed and ran to her, kneeling in her blood. He rolled her over, and her neck made a sickening sound as he lifted her head. Mother. Why? Tears filled Ozio's eyes. She could not speak or move, though she wanted desperately to comfort Theus. With the last of her strength, she tried to reach up and stroke Theus' cheek, but she barely managed to twitch her bloody palm. In desperation, she looked up at Theus and fought as hard as she could. I love you. I am sorry. She stared into his eyes, praying he would read her, knowing these would be her last words. Her strength failed her, and Theus watched the light fade from her eyes. Fear gripped the young pup now. Where was Oliver? What if whatever had gotten Xion had gotten to him as well? What if he had sensed something and gotten up to investigate? He closed his mother's eyes and laid her head gently on the floor, then changed to a fox and sprinted down the hall to wake his father. Xion tossed and turned now in his bed. He never could sleep well without Xion at his back. He thought he had heard something, but then thinking it was a dream, he rolled back over. Then he was jolted awake by Thea's screams of terror. He jumped up from his bed and went for his sword before dashing toward the door, but he stopped short before reaching it. Oliver was standing out in the corridor in his fox form. His shadow, cast by the flickering torches, danced on the walls as his gaze pierced Xion. Oliver. Xion called out, but Oliver did not reply. He tilted his head and pounced. Xion managed to grab Oliver by the neck and throw him off. "Son, what are you doing?" Xion thought Oliver had lost control, but this was different. Oliver's eyes were empty as he lunged at his father once more. Oliver fight it. Xion sidestepped Oliver, but Oliver turned and dug his fangs into his father's calf. Xion changed his hand to claw and ran it down Oliver's back, causing him to let go as Xion spun away from him. Xion called his sword to him and turned to his son, now barely able to stand from the pain in his leg. As he turned to face Oliver and saw the blood staining his maroon fur, his mind turned to Bonnie, and his heart sank as Oliver stammered, "I can't." Then out of the corner of his eye, he saw Theus frozen wide-eyed in fear in the hall, and quickly returned his gaze to Oliver, and it was as if time itself stood still. "Everything I have done I did for you, Oliver. Will I have to kill you now as your brother watches on? What will become of the desert when the man who was supposed to be their first true king is killed, and by his father no less?" Xion thought to himself as he clenched his teeth and tightened the grip on the cold hilt of his sword, preparing to strike Oliver down when he pounced next. Then he remembered what Bonnie's father had done all those years ago, and he looked just past Oliver into Theus' eyes. "No, this is his world now, and I don't want him to remember me like this. As the man who slayed his brother. As the man I would become after killing you, Oliver." A tear fell, and with it went the sword from Xion's hand. It turned to sand long before it hit the floor, and as it did, Xion began to limp toward Oliver with his arms open as if to embrace his son one last time. Oliver changed to a human, still bearing his claws and fangs. He lunged at Xion's neck and plunged his hand into his chest as Xion wrapped one arm around him for the last time. He held his other hand out behind Oliver's back, and the familiar column of sand whirled itself into his palm, the soft sand returning to hard steel as Xion ran the blade first under Oliver's shoulder, through his heart, his hand, and then into his own heart. Xion's legs buckled, and he fell backwards as Oliver thrashed and struggled, tearing at Xion in a desperate attempt to free himself. "Shh," Xion whispered to Oliver, holding him tight as his thrashing turned to stillness. Xion looked up to Theus, still paralyzed with fear, and thought to himself as he stared into his son's eyes, "Theus, they will call your brother a murderer and a traitor, but he is my son and your brother. I beg you." But there was nothing else. Xion coughed hard as warm blood filled his mouth, and his head came to rest on Oliver's shoulder as the light fled from his eyes. His hand fell from Oliver's maroon locks and brushed away a small pile of sand as it came to rest palm up on Oliver's back. Arenia watched on, nestled in the corner of a window. "I must tell Midas of the God King's demise. Perhaps this night can get darker still." Arenia whispered to herself with a pleased grin as she tossed her web into the wind and ballooned off into the night. She had never imagined Xion would allow himself to be killed, and while this changed her plans a bit, the outcome of her new scheme could be more than she had ever hoped to achieve.